All right. And can everyone see my screen as it's showing VS Code? Yes? Perfect. Can I get a quick audio check from someone actually?
Test, test.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, I can hear you guys. All right. So I was talking about the whole history of JavaScript, all that good stuff. Long story long, we're going to see some more advanced language features, and we're going to start learning about what tests are and how to use this library Jest to make some in JavaScript. Before we get there, we have to do a little bit of talking about looping. So let's talk about loops. So most programming languages have like two ways of looping. There's a lot of variations on these, a lot of flavors, a lot of sort of other ways to loop, but there's a for loop where you loop a fixed amount of times, and there's a while loop where you loop forever until some condition becomes false. And in JavaScript, I could do this. And when I run this code, it's gonna stop me at some point. And let me just go ahead and console log this other stuff out before we dive in. Let's see how far we get with this infinite loop before the computer stops us, because it does check to make sure we don't recurse or go into an infinite loop forever. Well, it looks like this one is just going to keep going. While loops, good for user interfaces because you need to always be listening for user input, right? For a user interface. Similarly, good for games and stuff like that. Pretty much bad for everything else. I prefer to avoid them because, I can do let x equals 1 while x is less than 11. Um, console log x, x equals x plus 1. And this loop will not go on for infinity. Assign, oh, it's a const. Okay, we'll call it something else. We'll call this q. Sorry about that. This loop won't go on for infinity. Um, but
Less.
yep,
Less.
in fact, I made the mistake there. And while I didn't do it on purpose, it sort of proves my point, which is that this is not an infinite loop unless I screw this up. Because if I make a mistake, the risk of a while loop turning into an infinite loop is higher. So you will generally see programmers avoid while loops because the for loop, you know, I can run this code and I can screw this up, right? Maybe I do I minus minus. I think that actually might produce an infinite loop. Yeah, so you can actually screw up a for loop as well, right? This one is going to go on forever because I've created this variable I. I told the loop, keep looping as long as I is less than 12, as long as this condition is 2, and decrement or subtract the value of I from 1 for each loop, right? Similar to this, but minusing instead of plussing, except these two parts are screwed up. In general, though, it is harder to screw up a for loop to cause an infinite loop than a while loop. And that's why I prefer them. And I would encourage you all to use for loops by default as well for that reason. Um, for the longest time, this in the while loop was like the only way to loop in JavaScript, with a couple exceptions we'll talk about later. There are some nice new language features like the for of loop, where if I have an array, I can do for let m of month, and I can console log m. And this can be any variable name I want, but it's often common to use like one letter or something short related to the bigger thing. And it looks like I forgot the S in months. We see a reference error because JavaScript cannot find a value that this name refers to because I had a typo. And again, it gives me the line number and it shows me right where the issue is. And now we see our months printed out here. I'll also just comment this out so we don't run this for loop every time. So this let of construct is really nice when you're iterating through a list. What this is good for is when you need an index. When you need the index value, use the classic for loop. This value I, you'll hear it referred to as index, because if we're going to put this here, let's say I is less than months dot length, and we I plus plus, and instead of console logging months or console logging I, let's console log months sub I, months sub I as in the element at index I in the array. And if I run this, I've got my months, right? And for the longest time, this was how you had to do this. This works just fine. This
Would
index
that
is
be
often,
off because of
oh,
indexing though?
say that again.
Would that be off because of like indexing?
It's really easy to make that mistake. I was wondering about that just now. I think I'm good because we start at 0, then we go to 1, then we go to 2, then we go to 3. You raise a good point. The length is not 0 indexed. And that can be confusing, and that is a common gotcha.
So it would be months.length plus one.
No, because the length is 4 things, but in terms of how we count them, it goes index
Oh, okay.
0.
Yep. I
Yeah,
see.
yeah. This is one of the big confusion points. Like I spent a lot of time as an undergrad with like a pencil and a piece of paper, either like writing simple bits of code out or drawing, making little lists of arrays and stuff just to make sure I had my indexing right. So this just takes a little practice, but it's definitely a common gotcha. Yeah, the length. So we're good to go here. So sometimes we need that index value for certain reasons. Like if I want to be able to print out, console.log, the index is, or if I need to do something with it, I'm going to use the classic for loop. If I don't need the index, I can use for of. So for of is nice because it avoids the potential of making errors in here. So if you don't need it, go with this for of approach. Last thing, let's talk about objects and looping through objects. And we have to do a little bit of work to do this. And maybe our objects are a little more complex. Maybe they're nested objects. And we have some information about each food. Maybe this is sort of like database info for users' favorite foods. And you could argue if pizza is Italian or American. And let me give us a little room here to see this code. This is really useful because I can do, console, and let me make this smaller. I can do console.log foods.pizza.cuisine. Right? When you want to look stuff up by ID, objects are really good for that, to sort of use it as a key value store. If you have a bunch of related information, and we don't care about the order of this stuff. It doesn't matter if sushi's here or pizza's here. So this is a great use for an object. But sometimes I might want to be able to say, list all the different foods and basically turn this into some sort of array. And there's a JavaScript function, and it uses this sort of fancy JavaScript object called object that has all these helper methods for dealing with JavaScript objects. And this term entries. And let's see what this prints out. And the month's length we can ignore. But check out what this does. It takes this object, it turns it into an array. And then it takes each key. And let me add something really simple here so we can see the example without all the complexity of nested objects. And let me run this one more time. So we can see right here, and let me pull up our Zoom annotator. Can you all see my little sort of laser pointer here? Cool. So we've taken an object.entries has taken each key value pair. This you'll hear this called like an object property and value, or key and value. We've taken each key value pair, and it's been turned into an array. And we have a nested array. We have an array of arrays, and we have the key and the value. And here we have the key and the value, and so on and so forth. And this is really useful, right? Because I can get the best of both worlds. I can look up food info easily, like we see here on line 100, by having the food as an object. And then if I need it as a list, I can turn it into it this way. Now, you can't really rely on object entries for ordering. If you care about the order of stuff, you should be using an array. But often we don't have to care about the order. So this is really great. And in fact, we can build a loop using this, and it would look something like this.
Question about the object entries.
Yeah.
Are they infinitely nestable? Like if you want to do info, carbs, 2 grams, protein, 3 grams.
Um, oh, you mean like how many times can I put an object inside an object inside an object?
Yes.
As many times as you want, and that's a huge part of JavaScript programming. Absolutely. Like that, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the beauty of arrays and objects. They're like building blocks. We've got a key and a value. The value can be anything. It can be an object. It can be an array. It can be something else. And if it's an object, well, guess what? That object has keys and values, and those can be anything as well. And same with arrays. You can have like 10 levels of nesting in an array, or infinite, or as many as you want. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And again, remember I said earlier, data is more important than logic. The shape of your data, how you organize it into lists and objects, makes probably the biggest difference in your code. And if you spend more time thinking about that, you will design better programs and make your life easier. And the more you think about your data and the kind of data you have and the shape of it, the better programs you will write. Let me show how to loop through object entries, and then we can look at some more advanced JavaScript language features. And yeah, great question. Actually, any other questions about object.entries or any of the other code I've written before I move on to this last loop?
I got a quick one.
Yeah.
I don't think it's gonna work, but after you did the object entries, it obviously puts it all in that list value. Could you then just do a dot sort, or I'm assuming that wouldn't work?
You probably could. Yeah, we haven't really talked about all the different functions that JavaScript arrays have, but that probably will work. Let's see how we do here. And it looks like it is indeed sorting alphabetically by the value of these keys. And just to kind of break that down for folks, let's say we have a list of days, and we'll have 4 names. So everything in JavaScript is an object, including arrays. And objects have properties, and those properties can also be functions. And so every single array in object has some built-in functions, and one of them is sort. And again, the MDN website is going to be the best way to see this stuff. And that's a great tool to know. And here we see indeed this array got sorted. Yeah, great question, Chase.
So if you wanted to say access the object we made in the info of sushi, you would treat it like an array then. You'd be like whatever sushi is, 0, you entries food 0 dot entries.
Yeah, exactly. Let me go ahead and write this as a loop, and then we can do that in there. Sound good? Can everyone still see this okay? I know it's a bit smaller, but I'm starting to kind of run out of screen real estate for certain things. Okay. If I need to get bigger, I can, but I figure we're better off being able to see all of the code. By the way, if you hover over stuff like this, these little arrows, you can kind of collapse and hide things. And that's just a VS Code editor thing. Like the code hasn't changed or anything like that. So just something good to know. Also, I was talking about all these nice little VS Code features. Like if I right click here on foods, I go to rename symbol, and I name it the foods, note that it renamed it here as well. So I think the hotkey is F2. Also note how if you hover over something, you get this really nice autocomplete. But when you need to rename stuff in VS Code, get in the habit of using VS Code to do it. Make the computer do the work. Get rid of the opportunity of a typo of renaming a variable in 5 places and use your editor to do that. Let's go ahead and let's loop. Actually, I've got a bit more real estate now that we've collapsed that. Let's go ahead and loop this up. So it's going to look something like this. For let food of object dot entries the foods. And let's just console.log food. Let's just see what each one of these is. And let me comment out these other console logs. And let's go ahead and run this code. So here we see there's month.blank still hiding around. But we see for each loop through here, here's the first one, right? And it's an array, and we've got the key and the value. The second one is an array with the key and the value. The third one is an array with the key and the value. So like you were saying, if I want to, I can do, let's say const food name equals, food sub 0. I'll just call this name. Const info equals food sub 1. And I'll console log and say food name is name. And we'll console log and we'll say food info is info. I'm going to change this from info because I'm using info as a key value in this one, and I don't want confusion. We'll call this data. And so the issue here is we can use, I don't want to get into what this is, but essentially if we need to like print out an object when we're kind of doing string stuff like this, we can use this JSON.stringify command in JavaScript. And so here we see we grab the first element in the array, and that's the name. And the second one is the object with the other stuff. And then, like you were saying, if I wanted the cuisine, I would do, console.log cuisine is data.cuisine. Right, so this combination of arrays and objects is really powerful.
I just want to ask one quick question to clarify because I feel like I heard the answer, but maybe I'm second guessing myself. For the dot notation, you can only use that if the key you're trying to access is a string, right?
No, you can use it for anything.
Oh, even like an integer or anything?
Yeah, here, just for fun, for sushi, I'll change cuisine to 743. For pizza, we can change cuisine to false. For pasta, I'll change cuisine to null. That dot notation is how you can access any property on an object and get the value of that property. It doesn't matter what the property is.
Oh, okay, sorry. I meant more like by using the key because like you have the dot cuisine. Could you do like if the key was like a 0, like an
Oh,
orderless?
you can have these be numbers. I think that'll work. Let's see if that works or if it throws an error. Yep, that works just fine. Let's see if we can find it in here. Cuisine, food name is pasta. So, food name 0, this is where JavaScript and 0 because JavaScript tries and treats 0 as falsy. Yeah, putting it here as a number, I'm not sure if that really works. There's other ways to do it. I don't want to get into it now though, because it's a little too in the weeds.
No worries. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. The short answer is the foods sub 50. That might do it. This is another way to access objects, keys, and properties. It doesn't seem to like that either. I'd have to look it up. In general, you probably don't want to use a number as an object key.
Can you return multiple, I guess, properties for one key?
You will get back whatever the value of that key is. Key and property are the same thing. You'll hear the words used interchangeably. Like here, the key is sushi, and you'll get back whatever's here. In this case, it's an object. It could be a string. It could be a number. It could be anything else.
Okay, so like let's say you had three, I guess, of the
Mhm.
values, but you only wanted back two of them. So like if you had info, cuisine, and I don't know, cook time or something like that, but you
I
only
see.
wanted the cook time and the cuisine.
We're going to see something sort of like that, but the short answer is no. What you would do is you'd get the whole object back, and then you would just only deal with the bits that you cared about. Does that make sense? Awesome. Great question. We will see something similar to that in a little bit, but I don't want to get there yet. Great question. Any other questions before we move on? And these are awesome questions, by the way, folks. Okay, awesome. Yeah, and you
I
all
have-
are
I have
thinking
a
about
question.
all the right stuff. Yes, what is it?
Looping through an array, you use of. Looping through an object, you can't use of, right? You have to use in.
Yeah, there is a way to do the for in. Let's see here. Give me one moment. Um, so there is another. What we're doing here is object entries turns our object into an array, essentially, with stuff inside it. There is a loop, like you're saying, like for thing in my foods or the foods.
And does that default to the key? The thing becomes the keys, or do you have to specify
Yeah,
the foods.keys?
it's gonna do. Objects have a lot of sort of properties by default that we don't see. Like, dot log is a property on the console object. Dot sort is a property on the array object. So in general, it's not recommended. Where does it print out? I would just avoid this and use object entries instead, is the short answer.
Yeah, what I see is for in is like specifically for an object, and for of is, more broad. As long as it's iterable, for of will work, but for in is specifically for an object.
And instead of saying object.entries, if you wanted to specify object.keys, then that should work, right? And then you would only be dealing with the keys in case let's say you had an object, it was a JSON or just this giant object, and you didn't know all the keys and you wanted to know what they were in order to iterate through them. Then you could say, let food of object.keys
Sure.
to iterate
Sure.
through. And then you could append into an array or whatever you wanted to do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, let of is just for arrays. That's correct. Object.keys gives you just the key names back from an object, like you were saying. So sometimes we might want to do this as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and you can use for in. You should probably avoid it. And honestly, unless you're already aware of it, you don't really have to worry about it right now. There's some other ways to loop as well that we'll see.
Yeah, I was gonna say
in a little bit.
Mozilla like specifically talks about for in and for of. I mean, just as a reference point.
Oh, do they?
Yeah.
Let's see. We'll take a quick look because I might be wrong here.
Oh, sorry. Actually, I'm in W3 schools. Sorry, but I'm pretty sure Mozilla probably talks about it too.
Yeah. So, you're right. This does work pretty nicely. It gives us, it looks like for in gives us the property names. Like here we have a property name and we have to use it to grab the value from the object.
Because you can't use bracket notation if you don't know what it's called.
Yeah, this is more than I want to get into right now. They both work. To be honest, I'd have to do a little bit of Googling to see if there's a recommended best practice, but they'll both do the job.
All right.
Cool. Thank you. Let's take a look at some of these newer JavaScript language features. Let me go ahead and make a new file. And as to your guys' points, you guys aren't wrong. There's just a whole lot of JavaScript language features, and we're not going to go. I'm just hitting kind of the most critical stuff today, or the conceptually important stuff. So let's talk. Are we good to go for maybe like another 20 something minutes and then take a break? All right, awesome. Let's talk about arrow functions and first class functions, and then that'll probably be a good breakpoint. So we've talked about functions. And I can write a function like this, and I can use it to say hi to Alice. There's actually a couple different ways to create functions in JavaScript. This is what's called, I believe, a function definition or a named function. Something newer is what's called an arrow function. And it looks like this. And there's a couple different ways to write this. I'm going to kind of write it the verbose way, and I'll then show you the shorter way. And I need to give this a different name. We'll call this say hi arrow. And if I run this code, we get the same thing. Now, what's going on here? Our named function has an argument, name. Our arrow function has an argument, name. And in fact, I could give this one, another argument, and I could give this one another argument. And I could do the same thing here. And I could fix my typo that the little sort of VS Code dot squigglies were warning me about. And I can run my code. And I forgot the space, but that's okay. I forgot the space here, but that's okay. And both these functions, you can see the similarities, right? In these parentheses, we create the function arguments. We have this thing here that's an equal sign and an angle bracket that looks like an arrow, and that's where the name comes from. And they both have curly brackets to show the code block, right? The same way that we use curly brackets with if statements to show a code block, we have curly brackets here for the code block. The difference is that this is like this thing that we're assigning to a variable, while this, is a function that we've seen, right? There are some other differences between arrow functions and named functions that I'm not going to go into right now, but this touches on a really important JavaScript language feature, something called first class functions. And first class functions mean functions are variables. They can be passed like variables. And this is a language feature. JavaScript has it and Python has it. Many languages do, some don't. I could actually do this. And I'm going to hop over here and copy this stuff. And this is what's called, I think, I want to say it's called an anonymous function. Let me make sure I get the name right. Yeah, it's called an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name. We assign it to a variable, but it doesn't have a name. And this will work just fine. And it looks like I might have an error in my code because it seems to be hanging. Or my laptop seems to be going extremely slow. There we go. I don't know why, folks. My laptop was going slow there for a second. Hopefully this seems a little weird. Or if you've seen it before, you'll know what this is, but it should seem a little weird. All of these different kinds of functions we can assign as variables and pass them as arguments to other functions. Functions are actually data too. Code is actually its own data. I can make a variable, let's just do let, and we'll say like this holds a function. Remember I was talking about pass by reference versus pass by value? Well, this is very much pass by reference. And let's set this equal to say hi. I just assigned a function as a value to a variable. I can do it with any of these functions. I could even pass these functions as arguments. This is called a callback when you pass a function as an argument. And in fact, I want to have a name. I still want the weather, but I want the callback function. And I'm going to call the callback function and pass in name and weather. Now, I have to know that all my functions have the same arguments. It's called a signature. The inputs and the outputs form a function's signature. But now I can do console.log supergreeter, Zach, Blizzard, say hi. And it looks like I got something wrong. So let's see what I got wrong. This says undefined. The first message worked.
Isn't the other function called say hi arrow?
I should have 3 of them. Say hi arrow, say hi to, and I should be able to pass any of them as an argument. I may have forgotten something, but the first and simplest and my favorite debugging technique is simply console logging every single bit of data until I figure out where I went wrong. So let's console log that, and I may change that, like you were saying, to see if it fixes it or not. So the function got passed in just fine. They do have the same name, but I don't seem to be calling it. Oh, I know why. I know what I did wrong here. So here's my say hi function that I'm passing in as an argument. What am I doing wrong, folks? Why aren't I seeing this printed anywhere? This is a tricky one because this is new. Say hi doesn't console log anything. It returns a string, right? So this is returning. This is the string, um, you know, hello, Alice, it's sunny or whatever. But does super greeter return that string to then be console log? It does not. I forgot this return statement. And now I see what I was expecting. And I can do this with any of my functions. Like you were saying, Chase, we can do it with the arrow function. They all do the same thing, so we won't see anything different, but we can do it with say hi to. So what we're seeing in action is what's called first class functions. Functions are first class in the programming language. They can be assigned as values to variables and arguments just like any other data type, which is extremely powerful because it lets us make incredibly flexible and composable code. I'm guessing parts of this may be newer, so I do want to check in and see what questions people have and how folks are feeling about this. What do we think?
I mean, I understand it. I just don't understand the reason for it.
Right. Yeah. We will see some of this in action in a minute. Here's a good example of the reason. Let's say we have a really big program and I want to be able to give different greeting messages based on different conditions. This way I can dynamically choose what kind of like greeting function I call.
So these could all have the same name, but because they're assigned differently, like an arrow could have the same name as an anonymous, or I'm confused.
Well, let's say, actually, that's a good point. Um, there's a lot of different things we can do with this. And I normally don't like to do this, but I am going to say, let me press pause on that question and we'll come back to it later. But I will show you guys this. Well, let me show you guys this first. Let's see, what did I do wrong here? Say hi is not a function. Oh, because it's hello. And of course, I forgot I have to console log this because I keep returning stuff. So console.log my array dot, or just some array dot sort. Somewhere there's a console object and it's got a property named log and it's got a function. Let's call this my console. And let's pretend for the second that we were doing this some other way, but all of those properties on JavaScript objects where we're using functions, this is how we attach them because we can assign these things as variables. Now, I do want to show one thing with arrow functions. This is the long way to write an arrow function all the way up here. You can, in fact, write them extremely succinctly if you only have one line. So if you have more than one line, you need the curly brackets and the return statements. If your arrow function just has one line, you can do it just like this. And so what you end up seeing is stuff like this. Where for all sorts of little functions, you can use arrow functions. There's a lot of syntax here. And I think that's the biggest challenge. And it's okay that that will take a while to click. The main thing is recognizing that these are all functions. And there's really no wrong way. To be honest, if writing it out as sort of anonymous function like this makes life easier, I would say do it. When we get to React, you'll kind of need arrow functions, both because it's the convention and for some other reasons. But to get started, it's okay. So I just want to check in and see what questions folks have about all of this, because I've covered a whole lot of ground.
I think it might just take some time for most of it to click, but I will say the callback functions,
Yeah,
yeah, that part kind of confused me a little bit.
yeah, for sure. Let me show one or two things, and then it might be a good time for a break. Touch. Let's use arrow functions as callbacks with in a very sort of modern way of writing JavaScript. Let's say we have an array of users. They have a first name and a last name. And I'm just going to make up like 3 of these just so we have enough users to be interesting. Maybe 4. And we'll have Alice and Bob and Carol and David. These I feel like are music people. There's some very interesting functions that arrays have that use callbacks. One is for each. Let's do it this way. This for each method, you have to pass it a function as an argument. You have to pass it a function as an argument. Doesn't have to be an arrow function. And it doesn't have to be defined in here. I could take this code and paste it here, and I can make this const print user, and we can make it an arrow function like this. And I could put in here print user. For each iterates through each individual element of the array and passes it in as an argument to the function that we give it. How are we feeling about that? Awesome. And I appreciate the thumbs up. Now, it starts to get even more interesting. Let's make another arrow function. Make full name. It takes a first name and a last name. And it is going to return a string that combines first name and last name with a comma separating them, right? So this should return Alice Waters. Another array function, and these borrow concepts from a philosophy of programming called functional programming. Because if JavaScript is a universe where everything is an object, there are programming languages where like everything has to be a function. And JavaScript is actually a bit of a combination of both. You don't see as much of this in Python, but you see a lot in JavaScript. And a program is a bunch of data flowing through a bunch of functions, like water flowing through a bunch of pipes. And here we can do users dot map, make full name. And this is actually going to return something. What does map do? Map transforms each item in an array. Map is going to take each individual element in the array, pass it into our function. Our function is going to return something. And we're going to get a new array with those transformed items. And let me comment. this out so we don't see these print statements. And of course, this is the printing issue of printing stuff nicely. And I think I did something wrong here. I did a couple things wrong here. Users is an object. This does not take in an object. This takes in two arguments. I wrote this wrong. Let's fix it. User dot first name, user dot last name. I think that should do it now. Yeah. And if we print out our original list of users, it is unchanged. Map does not modify the original array. This bit here, this is our original array of users, unchanged. Map has created a whole new array where each item is mapped or transformed into something else. This is actually incredibly useful. Incredibly useful. And the way you will normally see stuff like this written is like this. Now, this is extremely succinct and maybe more difficult to read, which is why I wanted to build up to it in pieces. But you can see how I was able to combine a whole lot of power in one line of code.
These are called high order functions, right?
Yeah. A higher order function, I think, is when, yeah, thank you. That is an excellent point. A higher order function is a function that takes another function as an argument. So map has to take a function as an argument, so it's a higher order function. So is for each. Even better, there's and by the way, you can do something called method chaining, where I can do map again. And let's say I want to take this new full name and I want to append something to the end of it. It's called method chaining. I can put those together. And you'll often see people write that like this. Because it's, again, data flowing through these pipes, data flowing through our functions.
I have a quick question, just for
Yep.
clarification. On line 23, the dot map, the U right before the arrow function, what is that? Is this just user?
Yeah. This can be, yeah.
Is that like
Often
the
you'll see it
iteration
short.
it's on, or
I'm sorry?
so? Um, did you have that object on the names? Is that just U? Is that the name of the object?
So map goes through each item in the array. Each item is an object. This is just a variable name that I get to create and define that holds whatever that thing is. So this could be user. This could be foobar. But these properties indeed have to exist on these objects if I'm going to get anything useful out of them. You know what I mean? Does that help answer your question? A little bit, not so much. Um, Yeah, the thing to remember, map, it's like a for loop. It's doing a for loop for us. And first it starts here. And so foo bar is assigned the value of this first object in our array right here. And that's passed in as an argument to whatever this code here is doing. And all this code does is grab the first name and the last name from this object and return them. And then it does that for the next item in the array, and the next one, and the next one.
Okay, so it's like the current iteration, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Like instead
perfect.
of having to write for of or for let or like write the loop, this does the looping for us. But we do have to pass it this function to do stuff for each item. There is also a filter. And what this will do is it will take each thing, and at this point, I've transformed these objects into strings, right? By the time we get to the dot filter, we have an array of strings that says Alice Waters is awesome, Bob Powers is awesome, Carol is awesome, David is awesome. And this function that filter takes has to return true or false. And if I hover over it, we'll see that VS Code tells me it returns the elements of an array that meet the conditions we get to specify in our function. It will get rid of the stuff that doesn't meet our conditions. So I'm going to write a ridiculously simple condition. And it's going to look like this. And I'm going to put some extra parentheses here because this is getting a bit confusing. Basically, this will only evaluate to true for one message. And filter will keep this, and it should get rid of everything else if I've written this right. And indeed, it only returns the one thing. This is sort of a toy example, but look at the power of what we've done here in these 3 lines of code. We've completely transformed our data, we've added stuff to it, and we've filtered it, and we've iterated through it. How are people doing? What questions do folks have, and what's on people's minds? Because I know this is a lot of stuff, and I do get pretty passionate about this part of JavaScript. And I know that there's a lot of new things that we're seeing here.
So do all high order functions create a new array, or do some of them edit the existing array?
It totally depends. For each that we started the example off with, doesn't create a new array. Map and filter specifically do create a new array and not modify the existing ones. And these are sort of functional programming concepts. There's another one called reduce that's a little more complex that we're not going to see today. And the whole idea of functional programming is you don't actually ever modify data, you just create a new version of it. And that's a little out of scope of today, but that's a little bit of the context here. Again, you guys won't see this for a while till we get to React. It's okay if a lot of this is new. I think the big takeaway is higher order functions are functions that take another function as an argument, and this idea of first class functions, that a function can be passed around as an argument. The syntax of arrow functions, there's a lot here. I've condensed an awful lot in here, and that will come with practice and time. But I think the concepts are the main takeaway. Any other questions before we take a break? Anything that might be good to go over or review or see again? Okay, let's take, what do you want to do? Like 10 or 15?
15.
Yeah. The afternoon gets long. Let's take a 15-minute break. When we come back, we've spent a long time talking about this. I'm going to show a couple other modern JavaScript features. The syntax will be a little funky, but there won't be anything conceptually as challenging as what we just went over. Then we'll take another break and we'll talk about testing. And I know it's a long day, and thank you all for being patient. Again, today and tomorrow are big days. The good news is a lot of these concepts we'll see again in Python tomorrow. So you'll get to see them in Python, and we'll have already spent the time going over the concepts. So part of that will go smoother because Python has higher order functions too, and Python has first class functions. And you don't use map and filter as much, but they're there. Let's take 15, and then when we come back, we'll see some more cool JavaScript language features, and then start talking about testing. Sound good? All right, folks, thank you very much, and I'll see you all in 15 minutes. So these are the same functions I wrote before the break, but I've written them out more verbosely in a more traditional way. And if we have users and the input, if I can grab the input, right? This input of users gets fed into this map function, and that spits out this other array, that looks like this. Because it makes a new one. And that's the input that goes into filter. And then our output here is just the one item from our array that matches the filtering rule. And again, how do we design our universe? Everything is an object. Programs are data flowing through different functions. I don't know does this help a little bit, or is this just sort of adding to the confusion?
No, it's a good mental model.
Yeah, awesome. And time and practice will help, right? And to put these two next to each other, and then we will move on because I realize I've been going about this for a while. If we have this, and let's see if I can kind of position this. Close enough. And then what we have here is pretty much the same thing. There's an extra map step, like saying people are awesome. But that's the idea, where the output of this gets fed in as the input to that. And then that outputs this guy over here. Right? And I'll get rid of this extra step. And now we actually have a fairly exact visual representation here on the right of our data flowing through our code. And again, this is an introduction. If some of this feels like a bit much, don't worry about it too much. We'll see a lot more of this. Let me switch gears and let's look at some cool JavaScript language features called destructuring. And it kind of relates to this stuff, and it kind of answers some questions that people had earlier as well. And the more you all will see this, the more you'll see how sort of these pieces fit together. Let's see some modern JavaScript syntax. And all of this stuff is what's called syntactic sugar. That means it's an easier way of doing something we already know how to do in less lines of code. It doesn't fundamentally work in a different way. And if we have some array of stuff, we know how I can get each individual thing in the array. You know, I could do this. And maybe, you know, let's make this Alice. Let's make this Bob. Let's make this Carol. I mean, to be even more, actually, to make it even more interesting, let's go here. Let's grab our users. Let's use this instead. So, you know, I could do user 1, user 2, user 4. And I would get Alice, Bob, Carol. What I can also do is something called destructuring.
User 4 would be David.
Sorry?
User 4 would be David.
Say that one more time.
User 4 on line 14.
Oh, got it. No, this is correct. I kind of did this. It's a little tricky, but since we're 0 indexed, this is index 0, and this is index 1, and this is index 2, and this is index 3. And that is kind of confusing. And I did do it on purpose a little bit. If I was doing this for real, I probably would find a way not to confuse my life. Like,
I think
these
he
are
was saying
bad
the name
variable
was
names.
wrong.
Sorry?
You said the name was wrong because you say Carol, but it should be David.
Oh, yeah. You're right. You're right. I apologize. I did get that wrong. You raise a really good point, though. Variable names are really important because they help us understand programs. These are terrible variable names because they do induce confusion. I'd be better off just saying like user A, user B, user C, or if I know who these people are, just saying Alice, Bob, and David. And I see what you guys are saying too. I apologize. I totally missed that in the comments. That is that is legitimately confusing, and that was my bad. Thank you both for pointing that out. But this actually gives us better code anyway. So this is one way to do this. There's another way. It does the same thing, but it's syntactic sugar. And what I can do, and let me add Carol in here because otherwise this example will be a little too confusing initially, is this. And I think it might have been you asking about this, Jack, if there's a way to just grab apart a couple properties of an object that we care about. And we're going to see that in just a minute. So
Yeah,
this
that
is
was me.
called, yeah, we're going to see that with objects in just a minute. And we're going to use the same technique, but for objects. So I can destructure an array to grab the different parts. And I can name these, again, whatever I want. the variable names don't matter. So this is often really useful just as syntactic sugar. The more you write code so that we don't have to write all of this. If I know I want to use like 3 of these users and I don't care about user 3, you'll often see variables whose name is underscore. That's assigned to other programmers that we don't care about this. This is a placeholder because I need this to get to David, right? Because when I'm destructuring an array, order matters. So if you're reading this code and you saw this, you would know that we don't really care about this user here. That this is just here because I want to grab David as well. And since David is last, I need a placeholder here. Do folks have any questions about sort of the technique here with array destructuring?
So
If
Okay.
you don't know how many indexes are in the array, can you still do this?
I mean,
Can you do it dynamically is what I'm asking, like through a loop?
you probably want to do it a different way in that case. What you can do is, let's see if I can get this right. These 3 dots are what's called a spread operator. Because we're spreading out all the other items of the array into this one variable. And this first console log here, I see it's Alice. The second console log here, other users, I see it's everything else. So, with arrays, order matters. So I can't get around that. And if, like you said, you don't know how much is in there and I need to find like the 7th or something, then at that point you need some sort of loop. But otherwise we can do this. And we can see here that, again, that spread operator gives us the remaining things in the array. This is a good way to combine arrays, by the way. You can also combine arrays this way. If I have some more users, like, I don't know, I don't know where that one came from. And it should be first name and last name just for consistency. I could actually do this. And this will combine these into a new array. And I'll still have my original list of users. There's some other nice tricks with the spread operator and arrays as well, but I don't want to go too deep into this, and I want to show us destructuring with objects. Do folks have any questions around array destructuring before we move on? Cool. And again, this isn't stuff you have to master today. All of this stuff is just tools in the toolbox. It's like you've got a hammer, a saw, a nail, flathead screws, Phillips screws. There's no wrong way to hang the picture on the wall. First, make it work, and then you can worry about cleaning it up. Let's talk about object destructuring. And this one is pretty cool. Let me make sure I get it right and look at my notes real quick. Before I start writing out some syntax that's just totally wrong. Okay, there we go. So let's go to our users. Let's add a favorite food. Let's add email. And I'm just going to grab that first user, Alice. And in fact, let me just copy and paste this just for readability. And I'm going to put these all on different lines. And Jack, like you were saying, what if I've got a user, but I only care about their email address? I can destructure an object. I use curly brackets instead of the square brackets. I have to use the property name. There's a way to get around this, but it's an extra step and it's not worth showing right now. And honestly, this is great. Because otherwise, what I got to do is, const email equals alice.email, and maybe I want their favorite food. Maybe I need to send an email to all the people that love sushi or something. Right? And if I have an object with a ton of stuff, I might have like 5 or 6 lines of this. Instead, I can use object destructuring. And this is syntactic sugar. It does the exact same thing. I'm 99% sure that under the hood, the JavaScript engine takes this line of code and turns it into these 2 lines of code. This is really just for our readability as programmers. So this is object destructuring. And I want to see if folks have any questions or things that you're curious about with this. Okay. Awesome. We can also use the spread operator with objects. And this is really useful. Maybe we need to do like Alice full profile or something. And I want all of Alice's info, but I also want like his preferred customer, crew, phone number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, address, street, like 12 Drury Lane. What was it? Beverly Hills, 90201 or something. And now I can spread all of the other properties. I just need to add a comma here, and that was what the squiggly is. And if I wanted to, I could do the spread up here. In general, I kind of put the spread at the bottom. I think it's easier to keep track of stuff this way. And now if we look at Alice's full profile, we see all of that information. Right? And this is a copy. Because this is not passed by reference. Like if I now change Alice favorite food to pizza, and we look at Alice's full profile again, her favorite food is still sushi. So we were talking about pass by reference and pass by value earlier. The spread operator is not a reference. It's making a full copy, more or less, of the object or of the array, which can be extremely useful. Because I can then, if I need to change stuff, I can change it without it impacting the other. Do folks have any questions about the spread operator and object destructuring? Okay, awesome. How are we feeling? We doing okay? Yeah, I know there's a lot of stuff here. As I said, today and tomorrow are big days, so thank you all. What we're really seeing, as you all are probably figuring out, as I'm repeating, are concepts that we're going to see over and over and over, right? And thinking about, am I copying my data or do I have a reference to it? Because that's going to matter in other things as well. Let's talk about importing and exporting, and then we can take a break and move on to testing. Importing and exporting in JavaScript are a little funky. Let me make a directory. We'll call it my project. And let's go in here. And let me open up VS Code here. So I have the command prompt there. And we'll save the changes. And bear with me as the screen shifts and we open up the new one. And this is just my lazy way of doing this. I'll bump the font size up a bit. And, most projects would have a README in the root directory of the project, not of the file system. And so I'm going to put it here for reference so we can see this in the Explorer window. And the Explorer window will be a helpful guide as I talk about importing and exporting. So when you hear project root directory, don't think like root user file system root. You'll also hear project base directory. Think like base directory for the project that everything else is inside of. And if this, was a Git repo, the .git directory would be in here as well. So let's talk a little bit about importing and exporting because most programs have many different files. And often what we might have is one file that has one or more functions. And I'm going to write a function that does a little bit of math. What's a factorial? Factorial 5 is 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. We write it as 5 factorial. So 4 factorial is 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. 3 factorial is 3 times 2 times 1. 2 factorial is 2 times 1. And 1 factorial, plain old 1. And let's put 5 here just for fun. And what the heck, let's put 6 here just for fun. And don't worry too much about the math behind this because I just wanted to lay that out so we have a little context. Let's write out this logic. We're going to count down from a number and do some multiplying. And this is product equals product times I. So 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. And then we're going to return our product. And you could imagine how with all the nice sort of tricks and arrow functions and stuff we've been learning, there's a way to write this code more succinctly. This has the benefit of being readable. And now that I've got this, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to run this. Let's print out factorial of 5. And I actually think that's right. I just haven't done factorial math in my head in a while. we might as well, let's put some other ones in here. Because 3 times 2 is 6 times 1 is 6. So 3 factorial should be 6. That I can do in my head. If 3 factorial is 6, we're probably good to go. All right, we're looking good. So that's my back of the napkin test confirming my factorial function is right. As my program gets bigger, it's nice to not have the code that runs my function in one spot in the same file as the function itself, especially as I might have many different functions. Writing good comment documentation is actually really important. There's actually a format to do it called JSDoc, and it looks something like this. And we would say number to get factorial of, and we would say this returns a number that returns factorial of num. So I don't want this code in here. I kind of want another file that's sort of like my main method. I'm going to call it the runner, and this is what I'm actually going to execute. I'm going to take this code here and copy it and paste it in here. I'm just going to say like main file. And so now I'm going to run this. And the only problem is we talked about scope. Very similarly, there's sort of this concept of namespacing. Node.js is looking for some function or some variable or anything with this name, and it's not finding it in this file. I have to import it from another file. I have to tell it where it is. There's 2 different ways to import stuff in JavaScript. The old school way, but the simpler ways was something called CommonJS modules. And we use this command called require. And it's going to return something. Require is actually a function. Let's see what my red squiggly is complaining about here. Comma expected. This is the function. It's going to go to this file, and what I want it to do is grab factorial and return it. And let me make a split here so we can see this. There's just one problem. Right now, the JavaScript engine won't know what to grab from here. If I run my code like this, I still get this factorial is not a function error. In fact, I don't even know what that factorial on line 5 is. It's probably null or undefined. And indeed, it just says factorial is not a function. So over here, I need to tell Node.js and JavaScript what I'm exporting. And I use this special object called module. And it has a property named exports. And forgive that, incorrect autocomplete. Man. Module. There we go. Dot exports equals my function. And this is actually an object. And we're assigning it this function. So this now is what require does is this returns module.exports, which means it returns factorial, because that's what we've set it to here. And now I should be able to run my code. Now, if I change this to something else, watch what happens to this console log on line 8. We see hello world. If this was an object, well, you know what? I'm getting an object that has my function back, but I still get a type error. Wouldn't it be nice if I could destructure this object and just grab the property that I needed from it? Right? And you can think of this as, if you want, I'm not going to use exports because that's sort of a special word, I think, but let's just call this the exports object. Right? If I was to write this out in full, this is what the code does. But now that we know about object destructuring, I can write this a lot more succinctly. And once we get used to that syntax, it's much more readable and expressive. So let me just pause and check in because I've been doing a good amount of talking and see what questions folks have and what people are curious about. How are we feeling?
So does this mean I didn't realize my video was off. Does this mean that like if you have it like this, you don't need to do import or
You mean like the like you've probably seen something like import factorial from like /factorial.js
yeah.
or something like this? Yeah, that's a great question. And let me see a quick show of hands. Who has seen this code before, even if you haven't worked on it? Who's just seen something like this? And most of you have done this in FOP, those of you that did it. How many people have used this? Okay, cool. We will end up using this. This is the newer way of importing called ES modules. It is the better way to do it. I think in order for it to work, we need a package.json file with a certain setting for it to work. I don't think it'll work just on its own. That's the difference, and that's why today I just wanted to show the older way for simplicity.
Okay, cool. I didn't even know you could do it this way.
Yeah, totally. This is before that way with import existed. This was the only way. And this was years ago. And then the newer way came along, and it wasn't supported in all the browsers. So this still stuck around, and now the newer way is pretty well supported. It still has a bit of an extra step. So this is another way. Require actually executes this code. It's actually really interesting. If I make a file, let's just call it scratch.js. And that's all that scratch.js is going to do. If I go over here and I just do require scratch.js, I'm not even worrying about what this is returning. Watch what happens. See that hello world statement? That's because require actually runs and executes all the JavaScript in this file. It also does the extra step of taking whatever's in here and bundling up and returning it. Again, we'll be using the newer way pretty soon, but this is good to see. And just to keep things simple for today, this is just what I wanted to introduce.
Yeah, I would figure that it having to run it first would be a lot worse for optimization, wouldn't it?
Possibly. You're right that the newer way does make some optimizations better, for sure. And that's part of why it's preferred.
Is there a benefit to making module.exports as an object and then calling it, requiring it through that constant object factorial instead of doing it the other way?
As your code gets bigger, what you tend to have is maybe like a collection of related functions. And by the way, this is shorthand for multiply. If I'm adding something to an object and it's going to have the same name, I can just do this comma, and that's syntactic sugar. So that's the same as if I did multiply. So, this is what generally happens a lot of the time. And if I just start off this way, then this is set up and this is set up. And I don't have to change it later. And it sounds like a little thing, but you'll find that like you lose like 30 minutes of your life all the time to little stuff like that that you forget when you're knee deep in something more complicated. So I like simple patterns that I can use everywhere. Great question. Any other questions around importing?
In
Okay.
the factorial JS, I
Oh,
don't
yeah.
understand lines 13 and 14. I don't get those. Like
Oh,
what
these
is
two?
that saying? Yeah, 13 and 14.
Yeah, those are actually comments.
Okay.
And that's just VS Code highlighting the comment. There's a style of commenting called JS doc. Notice how if I hover over my function, this VS Code documentation is coming from my comments. And like the first part is terribly formatted, but that at param int and returns, that's all from here from my comment. And like over here, if I hover over it in this other file, like if I close this out, some of this stuff, like the function signature, comes from that. We don't get the best autocomplete, but there's some. So that's just like a more formal way of writing comment documentation for my code. We don't require everyone to do this, though eventually I want us to. My CS professor in school was a stickler for this stuff, and I hated it at the time, and I think it served me really well. So I encourage you all to look up like JS doc and like Python doc strings and the right way to sort of comment and document functions and classes and stuff. Does that help answer your question?
Is there more explanation of this like in the reading? Just because I feel like I don't know, I feel like this whole thing hasn't really clicked for me, the importing and exporting. I thought, I just wonder if there's more reading I can do that's, part of the curriculum. Or maybe I just need to rewatch this video.
Yeah, no, the video will go up. I pretty much walked through what's in the curriculum for today's lesson, and that's definitely worth a read as well. This stuff is just the comments. So this we can toss for now, especially if it helps us focus on the code at hand. And I think the main thing to take away from this is we'll learn a different way to import and export later. But for now, the way I import and export is I write my code, and it doesn't have to be a function. It could be a list of users. It could be an object or anything else.
What'd you say
But-
it was called? Like JStock or something?
Oh, JS doc. Yeah, I'll share it with you
Because
guys.
I'm looking on Visual Studio and finding extension that already has templates form up.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of resources out there. There's probably a better tutorial, but this is sort of the official JS doc. If someone can just repost that in Slack, I'd appreciate it. I think that the simplest way to break down importing and exporting is I've written some code. It could be a function, it could be an array, it could be an object. It could be a simple variable like important string term. Whatever I want to be able to export from a file, I need to add as a property on this object. I can use whatever name I want here. Maybe this becomes important word. Maybe this becomes all users. Then, when I want to import, over here, and let's get rid of this. Let's just get rid of this and this and this and this and this and this and this. When I want to import, I use this special function require, and I give it the relative path to where the file is. And if it was, in some other directory, I would have to do that. And if it was like a directory up, I would have to do that. And that's why having the Explorer window open, knowing what the base directory of the project is really important. And this will return this object. And, at this point, I could do const my users equals imported object all users. I can do whatever I want with this object that I've imported. Does that help it break down a bit the mechanics of importing and exporting?
I think I'll just need to practice it.
Yeah, it comes with practice. Yeah. Main takeaway is code here. I got to stick it here as a property on an object. I import it here. And then what you usually see is object destructuring of whatever I want to use. Because maybe I don't need every single thing in this particular file. Okay. Why don't we take a short break and then we can talk about testing? Sound good? Let me pause the recording. All right. So we've covered a whole lot of ground today. Let me open up the README for this lesson, which is a level up, right, in the file system. We've done a very thorough grand tour of JavaScript, the language, and modern JavaScript and advanced JavaScript features, and some really fundamental concepts of how programming languages work, like pass by value versus pass by reference, first class functions, and scope. We're now going to talk about testing. I'm going to talk about the very basics of the Node Package Manager NPM. What is a unit test? Using this library Jest as a test runner, and what assertions are. And we'll see some mechanics of how to skip tests and some quality of life things. And we'll actually use most of the JavaScript stuff we learned. You'll see it, like you'll see arrow functions and first class functions come in here because they're just a core part of how people write modern JavaScript. What I encourage you all to do throughout this course is whenever you encounter a new NPM package or Python dependency we install with pip, just take 5 minutes and look it up because you'll learn a ton. And as a software engineer on a team, like you don't just add a new dependency. I would have to look at it. I would look at the commit history. I would make sure it's still maintained. I would see how many users it has. Like this has, 4 million weekly downloads, which is great. But if it had like 20 weekly downloads, it's like, no, I'm not using this code. It's not maintained. It's going to break. So these are really valuable habits to develop, and you'll learn more about the language ecosystem. NPM is where you can search and find all the different NPM packages we'll install. It points us to the Jest page. All of these libraries also have a GitHub page, and honestly, this can be a great place to go. I think it's also good to see what a good README looks like. Install instructions, getting started. Like this is a good standard. Note that they also have good first issues for anyone who wants to be an open source contributor. We can see closed issues. We learned about pull requests. Well, guess what? Jest works the same way, and you can see how someone writes this out, the code, the files changed, the discussion around the code. Can you put this test in a different directory? And this is pretty much what software engineering is like. So Jest is a JavaScript testing framework. It focuses on simplicity. It can be used with all these other libraries. JavaScript uses tons of NPM packages and libraries. It's a bit of a mess. I'm not going to go too much into the details of Jest, and there's a couple of tools out there. There's one called Mocha, and we don't really have to worry about it. The important thing to know when you're looking at these things, there's two parts of the docs that are important. The docs will always have a Hello World Getting Started tutorial, but when you're using this thing, find the parts of the docs that say API. And this isn't REST API, but this is like the application programming interface. This is like when I'm writing a test and I need to figure out exactly what this function does, where I can get the full spec and the breakdown. Just like if I'm learning to construct things out of wood, like building a doghouse, I just need a hammer and a saw, and I can draw it on a napkin. If I'm making a house, I need some proper blueprints. I need a bulldozer. If I'm building a skyscraper, I need massive amounts of documentation, and I need someone, who is certified to use the really high crane. that's, like 50 miles up or whatever. Point being, as our tools get more powerful that allow us to build more powerful things, we have to read the documentation. You can't just get into the 600-foot tall crane and use it. And it's the same with these tools. You don't have to read these docs in detail. What I do is I spend 5 minutes, I skim, then I dive in and write code. And then when I inevitably run into an issue, I go to the docs and I'm oriented. So that's kind of my spiel about Jest and testing and how to look at libraries and stuff. Does anyone have any questions before I start writing code? Okay, let's do it. So just to even install this stuff, I have to create an NPM project. I want to do this in my project directory. I'm going to use the command init for initialize. I'm just going to hit enter for all of these default values. Note that this file package.json was created. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Format, JavaScript Object Notation. It is a text file with a special format that is very similar to JavaScript objects, right? This is an object. The difference here is the keys have to be strings. There's some other minor differences, but that's the main one. And we see here some configuration information about our project, mostly stuff we don't care about. What matters here is where it says scripts. These are commands we can run from the command line. And this command test prints out a message to the command line. I can do npm run test. And I get this message, echo, no test specified. If I wanted to make another script, I can, and I can run it the same way. We're not going to have to make scripts. You're just going to have to run them. But I just want to show you a bit of how that works. Now that I've done that, I can npm install -- save Jest. And this will talk to the npm.js server, find wherever this Jest library lives on some server on the internet, and install it in a directory it'll create here. And it'll take just a minute, and it's going to install a zillion other things because every single JavaScript package depends on a zillion other JavaScript packages. I'm not going to go too deep into JavaScript packages and stuff today. I just wanted to point out a few things. Because we said -- save, our package JSON was modified. This dependencies property, that's an object, was created. And we have Jest, and we have the very specific version of Jest. There's also a file named package lock that has not just Jest, which it does have somewhere in here, but Jest has a whole bunch of other node modules that it uses. We don't have to worry about that. Jest itself and the zillion other node modules that it uses were installed into this node modules directory. This is why people have a love-hate relationship with JavaScript. And here is Jest. The main thing to know is the node modules directory, we don't want to save in Git and version control because it has a bunch of stuff. And what I actually want is the versions of my dependencies in package.json and package lock.json. We'll talk more about that as we get deeper into the course. But now that I have installed Jest, I can now use it and write a test file. And I can modify my test script to run Jest. And it does, and it throws an error, and Jest says no tests found, which is exactly correct because there are no tests. And there's some regex here that we can see that is just trying to find files that say test in it or say .spec or anything else. So we're going to write a test file for our factorial function. It's going to be named factorial.spec.js. And the .spec in the file name is important because Jest will look for files that say .spec in the file name and run those. And that's how Jest knows where to find a test. And I'm going to do a split. I do recommend you all start getting used to splits. I think they're incredibly useful. And I want my factorial code here on the left. I really don't need to worry about anything else. In fact, we'll add a couple other spaces just so we don't even see that. And my test file here on the right. Let's write some tests. I need to import my factorial. And in fact, I'm not even going to write a test. I just want to make sure that I did this right and that I don't get an error. So let me just npm run test. If I look at this, I see a couple interesting things. It looks like Jest found the test file. It printed out the console log, which is great. And then we get a fail because there are no tests, which is fine. I'm making sure I didn't screw up my import. I did a good job. I can now move on. As I said, I love running code every 5 minutes. We can use a command called test. And first, we give it a string that describes the test. And 4 times 3 is 12 times 2, which gives us 24. And that's the first argument to this function. I don't have to import this because when Jest runs this file, it will import a whole bunch of stuff for me. The second argument I pass has to be a function. Test is actually a higher order function. And the convention here is to use an arrow function. And inside this arrow function is the actual code of the test that Jest will run. And I'm going to use another function that Jest will import, and it's a comparison function. And I can tell it, run this command, and I don't want export all declaration, excuse me. Sorry about that. And I can use method chaining, and this is where sort of reading the documentation becomes important. But know that this expect basically returns a value, and the convention with Jest is you chain stuff like this. I can use this sort of shorthand to be instead of maybe like an equal sign because Jest does some other nice stuff along the way. I can say 24. And as you can see, part of the niceness of this, once you get used to it, is the readability. Now, as long as I don't have any typos or mistakes here, I should now be able to run my test. And now I have one test passing. Note this little green check mark and my comment right here. I could modify this. And what's really important when you write tests, first write the test, then make the test fail. Because what if I did this? Sorry. And this is just an example, but the point is, what if I screwed up the test, right? That test is always going to pass. There's a lot of ways to screw up a test. So the easiest way to double check is change this to something you know will fail. Or what if my code is wrong? Even worse. What if for some reason this is the first line of my factorial function? This is a simplified example, but you can imagine a more realistic scenario. Right? This is going to be harder to detect, to be honest. That's what multiple tests are for. But those are examples of why it's important when you write a test, make it fail. Because the test also needs to fail correctly. So my test failed, and we get some very useful error messages. It shows me the test that fails. It told me what it expected, 50. It told me the actual value that it got. It shows me which test was failing. There might be some additional information. So now that my test has correctly failed, I know that I've written a good test and I can move on. I just covered a whole lot of ground here. So this is a really good time to check in and see what questions folks have, what might be good to go over, because the next thing here is just adding a bunch of tests and sort of more layers. So before I dive into that, I want to check in and see where people are at and how we're feeling and what's on our mind.
Is there a way to sort of automate that test failing and then have it be marked as true? That way in case like you're changing stuff around in factorial, you have that factorial 4 dot isn't 50 or something.
I'm not sure I entirely understand, but when it comes to testing, dumber is actually better because, at the end of the day, like I want to force the code to do what it's supposed to do, and I want stuff to be hard coded because you can kind of write tests and end up with something that looks like this. And this isn't a very useful test, right? Because if my factorial function is wrong, then I'm just sort of screwed. So in general, you kind of want tests to be dumb. And when writing tests, you always have to kind of manually fiddle with it and you want to cause it to fail. In fact, with test-driven development, there's a whole methodology called red-green refactor, where before you even write the code, you write the test, you know that it'll fail, and then you write the code and you keep refactoring it until you get to pass the test. I know that was a little off topic, but does that help address what you were wondering about?
A bit.
Could you say it maybe one more time in a different way?
So like I said, it pertains to like if you're changing something, right? And you want to like for this, it would be you want to make sure it never hits like -1 because that's an answer it could never get.
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're thinking about how the code itself should behave. That's not a test thing. If I want to make sure that my factorial function throws an error message if we get to -1, that should be in the code itself. And then there should be a test to assert that the code handles that invalid value correctly or that situation correctly.
No, I meant in the test you would make sure because right you wrote it so that it would fail. But say someone else comes down the line and they have to mess with the factorial function. Is there something you can put in the test that checks to make sure that you know that failure does occur, right? Does that make
No, the
sense?
short answer is no. It's sort of your responsibility as a dev when you're adding a new test to kind of play around with values to make sure it fails correctly. And then people will kind of trust that and look at it during the code review process.
Okay, okay. That's all I wanted. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Totally. Let's add a couple more tests so we can expand on this. And that'll help too as we see kind of more examples. With Factorial, there's not like a huge range of stuff to test because there's not really different kinds of inputs. Though, let's actually think about this for a second. What are our edge cases or gotchas for Factorial? Like, what are some numbers that are not like all the others that are a little different?
Could be a
Zero.
float.
A float like 5.3? A decimal floating point number? Yep, that's a great point. What do we want to do about that? What's another example?
Negative.
Yeah, negative numbers. What do we want to do about that? What else?
Wouldn't be
What if-
zero.
Zero. Yeah. What's factorial of zero?
Zero.
1, isn't it?
I think it's 1, and I think I forgot to write that down. Because because if you think about it, 2, you could say it's 2 times 1 times 0, 2 factorial, and we know that that equals 2. And if 0 well, no, sorry, it should look like that. I'm pretty sure 0 factorial is 1. Can someone maybe just Google that and confirm for me?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. And it's
0
basically
factorial equals 1 because it represents one possible arrangement of an empty set, none at all.
Yeah, the easier way to think about it is 5 factorial equals 5 times 4 factorial. 4 factorial equals 4 times 3 factorial. 3 factorial equals 3 times 2 factorial. 2 times, and so on and so forth. And you can have mathematically a recursive definition of factorial. But if you need 0 factorial to equal 1, in order for this recursive definition of n factorial equals n times n minus 1 factorial work. And a lot of stuff in math works this way. And this is a little out of scope, but 0 is indeed an edge case here. And then I'll throw into the mix as an example 1, which is not too tricky, but worth thinking about. So these are really good to think about because these are the different kinds of inputs, right? Like a negative integer is a qualitatively different kind of input than others. So, input has a domain, input has a range. There's different categories of inputs, there's different kinds of inputs. And the more we think about this, the better code we can write. For instance, let's do some red-green refactor here. Let's do that factorial of 0 equals 0. Or, I'm so sorry, 1. I'm not sure if I wrote my factorial function right to do that or not. And it looks like I did, but it was purely by luck because I wasn't thinking about it at the time. And it's because we set product here to 1 initially, and then we count down. So we're never going to end up multiplying by anything 0 or below, right? Because this is I is greater than or equal to 0. What about negative numbers? Can someone maybe do a Google search and tell me what the internet says we should do for factorial of negative numbers?
By the way, to be clear, in the function that you're putting in right now, the first argument is just a comment. It doesn't mean anything. It's just something for us to know which test it is.
Exactly. It's what gets printed out here on the command line when we run the tests. Yeah, it's purely for the user, for the programmer. And I'm just using the triple equals because it's easy to see. Yeah, that's a good question.
Can you just put like in the function, like the line two, can you just put like if the argument given is less than zero to return a like statement saying negative numbers are not factorial or something like that?
Yeah, we need to return something, right? Um, this is an error case. You'll see a pattern. This is sometimes called guard. We'll learn about throwing errors and stuff later, but we can just say if num is less than zero, why don't we return false, right? Because I don't want to return a number. It's a bit problematic because in JavaScript, like zero evaluates to false and like stuff becomes falsy. So this isn't perfect. So we should never really be getting zero, I guess, for a factorial. So sometimes we might want to return a string, but this is a pretty good thing, I think. Because I don't want my factorial function to print a message. I want the code using my factorial function to see if there's an error and then decide what to do. Because it depends where we're using this code, right? And this is called the single responsibility principle. The factorial function has one job, and that's to give me the factorial. It'll be someone else's job to figure out how to print user-friendly error messages. And so let's test that factorial of negative numbers returns false. And we can do expect factorial negative 4 to be false. And I'm going to go ahead and run my tests. We're looking good. I'm going to do a sanity check. Let's make this true. Make sure it fails. It indeed fails. Just for fun, we'll make this negative 40. I don't really need to test a bunch of negative numbers because, in terms of the logic of how this code works, there's no difference between negative 4 and negative 40. So now we've got 0. We've got a positive integer. We've got, I'll throw in 1 because that's always a good edge case, and decimals. And I'm just going to declare that our factorial function only takes integers. I actually don't know what the mathematically correct way of dealing with non-integers is, but I'm not going to worry about it. And actually, you know what? I'm not going to worry about this at all because I do want to make sure we see the rest of the testing today and not get too sucked up into the factorial function itself. But this is good stuff to think about as you write code, and one way that you can actually use the writing of tests to help you write better programs. And let me go ahead and get rid of some empty lines here. And we'll just add one more test. Test that factorial of 1 is 1. And that's pretty good, right? I might want to add a couple more big numbers, but otherwise I think we're doing pretty good. Do folks have any questions before I move on and show how we can sort of better organize these tests?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you have to install Jest to every thing you're trying to test, or is it a one-time install?
So
you said you have to do it in your project, but
right.
we're not really doing projects. We're doing it like for tonight's homework, for example. You have a factorial problem. If you wanted to use Jest on that factorial problem, you would have to load up the folder, the directory in VS Code, and then install Jest into that. But if you wanted
that's correct.
And you have to do that for every single thing you want to use Jest for.
For every project, yes.
Wow, that's fun.
It sounds annoying. However, it ends up being a good thing. You can install Jest globally. The reason to avoid this is, let's say you and I want to work together on one of your projects. You share it with me. How do I know how to run the tests? If your code base doesn't have all the dependencies specified. Also, what if the version of Jest changes and it breaks some things? Do I want to have to deal with that in all my projects? What if I have a project from 2 years ago with an old version of Jest? It's nice to not have stuff interlock. It sounds like an extra step, but it's really not that much work once you get used to it. I do recommend you can just delete the node modules directory once you're done. If you really want, you indeed can install Jest globally. You would do npm install -g Jest, but I don't recommend it. And to be totally honest, I'm not quite sure when Jest gets run, if it's installed globally, if it'll find stuff right. This is sort of a cop-out, but this is a feature, not a bug. James, yes, sir.
Yes, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Adam. But for you, Tim, like, and anybody else who don't want to do all that creating, definitely do, when it comes to the projects, definitely do exactly what Adam is saying. You want to install just separately for each project. But in regards to the assignments, you could create a folder of just assignments, and have your virtual environment download Jest and just put all your assignments in that folder. And you shouldn't have to download it again.
So-
Would that work?
I
Adam?
did that. I already did that. In that case, I have to install it in the root folder and then just refer to it in the subfolders
Yeah.
when I run it.
So we do have you do that with Python, that default virtual environment we had you make. You're going to use that one virtual environment for a bunch of coding assignments for the next couple weeks, and you're going to use it until we get to Django. It's just a little trickier to make that work with JavaScript. I honestly, there are ways to do it. I honestly don't recommend it. I recommend just doing it this way. And if you really feel like it's causing you pain, then explore some other things. But otherwise, you're just setting yourself up for trouble down the line.
Okay. No, I'll do it the way you're recommending it.
Yeah. Also, like, again, software development is a team sport, and we want you all to do it the sort of industry standard way right off the bat. And even though all these assignments are little things, think of each of these as a software project where you want to be able to have all that code up there and delivered for other people to use and share and collaborate on, right? And just practice doing it that way now, so you know how to do it later. Yeah, that's a great question. Also, frankly, we want you all to get reps and sets on the command line. Let me show how to organize tests. You can use something called a describe block. And in here, you can put some tests. Like, let's put Factorial 4 in there. And let's make a test for, Factorial of 5. And now, and let me just zoom out a bit. Just I think it'll make it easier to see at this point. And now if I run my code, you can see that just that describe block description is there. You can put some setup code in here, but it involves some extra steps. The main value is organizing. Test invalid inputs. Right? And we've decided that a negative number is an invalid input. And, to do, write test for decimal value, and put here. And maybe a describe block that tests for edge cases. And edge cases is just sort of a programming term for anything that is out of the ordinary or tricky or gotcha, the way that 0 is here, because 0 factorial is a little special, right? And I'll throw 1 in there as well. And now, if I read this code and these tests, I have a really good understanding of them. And if someone else is reading my code, they can read the tests to understand how this works. And tests as documentation is actually a big part of testing and its value. And now I have some really useful error messages here, right? Let me just show you all a couple useful sort of quality of life tools. If I want to skip a test, for example, if I'm working on the assessment and I know that this test is going to fail, I can put an X in front of it. And note that over here, that test was skipped. I should be able to do that for a describe block as well. And again, I wouldn't actually like commit this little X into the code. This is for me while I'm developing to make my life easier. And similarly, I believe there's a way to just run only one test. And let me make sure I have it right before I demo it. Yep. And it is indeed, it's kind of what I thought. We can add a dot only. And I think it looks like that. And I think I got that wrong. Let me make sure I get the syntax right here. My apologies. Yep. One moment. It goes right here. Test dot only. And again, this is for me. And tests, the nice thing about tests is, let's say we've written this function and it works, but I want to make it better. Raise your hand if you've ever introduced a bug while working to improve some existing code that basically did what it needed to. Yeah, and if you haven't, you will. This is incredibly common. There's a term test harness. Having tests lets us more safely modify code and helps us. And that's what all this stuff is for. And similarly, I can run a describe block. So again, if I'm working on, say, the assessment, I probably want to focus on one test at a time and just get one test passing at a time. So I can use dot only to focus on one block or just one single test and just focus on writing my code to get that one piece working. For instance, let's say I do want to add a test for decimal values. Where it returns false. So I want 4.5 to be false. Well, let's do test dot only, because I know all my other tests are going to pass. I can do npm run test, and I get an error because this doesn't work yet, right? And I get this other value. Anyone know in JavaScript how to check if a number is an integer?
Type of? Oh no, that's Python.
Nope, that's right. Type of.
That's
Yeah,
correct.
type of.
Type of equals what?
Int.
Number.
Well, all the numbers are going to be numbers, right? And this raises a good point. JavaScript doesn't have an integer type. So let's go to be honest, this is a great ChatGPT question. I don't know why I have to log in because I do have an account. You can also Google this. Again, I don't recommend using ChatGPT to generate code. For things like this, it's really valuable. This is exactly what I would have Googled in the before times. And JavaScript has this number, they call it a class. It's not really a class. This number object with this function is integer. If I Google this, sorry. This is in some ways even better. As you can see, a million other programmers before me have asked Google the same question. And in fact, these days, Google just sticks its AI answer right in here, gives us a nice explanation. And actually, the first search result is the really good MDN docs. So Googling is actually kind of better. So type of is a good thought. We don't have a number type. If you guys are interested, you can poke under the hood and see how this does it. But we don't have to worry about it for now. And this will return a Boolean true or false. So what I in fact want is if this is false, return false. Or I'm so sorry. If this is no, that's right. And if float, return false. And that's what I do when I get confused to unconfuse myself. If it's not an integer, we want to return false and stop execution of our code. And now let's run our test and see if it works. And now it passes, and I can remove the dot only and run the whole test suite, and they all work. So you guys can see how you can build up a real workflow here, right? And it helps you organize and work on your code in chunks and one piece at a time. I know it's been a long day, and in fact, we're right at stand down time.
I got a quick question.
Yeah,
What
absolutely.
happens if you write dot only for more than one test?
It probably runs both of them. Let's find out. My guess is it runs them both. Yeah, that's a great question. I love it. And indeed, it runs them both, which is honestly pretty useful. Yeah, what else is on people's minds about testing? Whether it's mechanics, things you're curious about, big picture questions. What are our thoughts?
I remember earlier you brought up the concept of libraries and packages. Are they the same thing, or what does that imply with the term dependencies that you threw?
Yeah, it's a great question. You'll hear all these terms used interchangeably. A package and a library, same thing. Package, I think in particular, means you can use a package manager software like NPM, the Node Package Manager for JavaScript, or pip, I can't remember what it stands for Python, or for installing bigger programs on Linux, apt-get, or on Mac, the Brew Package Manager. But you'll hear the terms interchangeably. You'll also hear the term module. Module can have a little bit more of a specific meaning. When we get to Python tomorrow, we'll see that module has a bit of a more specific meaning for Python. But in general, you'll hear all those things tossed around interchangeably. And at the end of the day, it's code someone has written and organized and shared through one of these tools like NPM so that other people can use the code as well. Yeah, great question. What else is on people's minds? What else are we curious about? What might you like to see me code up or demo or what are we curious about?
Could you say again the install line for Jest? It's npm install Jest --save.
Yep. And this is our GitHub curriculum repo, we also have all these steps there as well laid out.
And do you have to do that for every project?
You do. However, the nice thing about things like package managers and NPM is because the package.json file for this coding assignment repo has Jest as a dependency, all I have to do is run npm install. So, in fact, let me just show the whole flow of this because it does, and I can show the get remote step as well. And let me open up iTerm. So I have a separate terminal so we don't get too confused. I'm just going to make a sort of placeholder directory here just so I have stuff. Is this font size good for everyone? Awesome. So let's say this is the coding assignment, one of the ones from today that I'm going to work on, right? I'm over here in the repo, read through stuff. I've done this one. I've done this one. Now it's time for linear search. I clone the repo. I navigate into it. What I'm going to do is on my GitHub, make a new repository with the same name. And select my own account as the owner. And then if I scroll down, they give me the steps to have the existing repo point to this one. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this command and I'm going to run it here. And, I always forget, I apologize, because we're modifying the remote URL. It has to be remote set-URL origin. If I do git remote-v, it should look correct. If I do git push, apologies, my phone is making noise. It should push that up to my repo over here. And if I refresh this, I now have the problem and I've copied the whole thing onto my own GitHub on a separate repo. And if we ever reorganize stuff, you'll still have this and you have all the commits. So that's that part. Now that I've done that, here's the good part. The package.json file with the dependencies is there. And Jest is already listed as a dependency. So all I have to do, and this is the important part that I should have mentioned earlier to what you all were saying and asking about. I just have to run npm install. It will install all the dependencies in package.json. And now I have in that node modules directory, Jest then everything else. And now I can start writing code. Right. So it's not quite as many steps as it seems, but also you can see, I think, the value of those like dependency files like package.json that have those versions. Because how sweet is that I can have a whole project that I can like install all the dependencies for in like one step.
What is
and
a
if you read
dependency?
through here, we'll also have one moment. You'll see, I think most of our assignments in the README also have install run instructions. Yes, and there was a question.
Oh, I was asking, what is a dependency? I'm still a little confused on that term.
Any code or program that a program depends on is a dependency. Like for this algo linear search program, I cannot run these tests without Jest, right? Jest is not a part of my source code. I didn't write it. Someone else wrote it. But I still need it to run my tests. So it's a dependency for my project. Similarly, not just like the tests, but like core parts of our programs as they get bigger are going to have dependencies. Like React.js, if we're making a front end app, is a dependency. Does that help? Yeah, great question. And again, think building skyscraper, not building gazebo, right? The bigger the thing we want to build, the more complex things are, and the more we kind of want to stand on the shoulders of giants. And that's why you see all these tools. Like Jest is overkill for this coding assignment. And in fact, if you go and you look at the assignments for part 1, we have our own little made-up test suite with console log statements. This works fine until you have a couple hundred files and like 5,000 lines of code and 10 developers, or even like 50 files and 2 devs. So we're kind of showing you the industry standard tools right off the bat. And as you're seeing, a big part of software engineering is tooling. A huge part of software engineering is tooling. We're using programs to build programs. Great question. What else is on people's minds or might be good for us to see whether it's related to this or anything else that might be on your mind? Okay, let me go ahead and stop the recording and we can wrap up because it indeed has been a long day.